So the manual of discipline, why is that included? Here, I'll have to speak lawyerly for a moment. Because remember, this is the 25 most, what did I call this course? The 25 most influential books in the Post-Apostolic Christian Church. I did not say the 25 most influential Christian books in the Post-Apostolic Christian Church. So, see the distinction? Because immediately, somebody, Joe, is going to say, well, this is a Jewish book. It's not a Christian book. Well, I didn't say these were all.
And it's not post-apostolic.
Yes, but the translations are post. I said, I'm talking lawyerly now. The translations are post-apostolic, and it wasn't discovered until 1948. So that's why. Now I've explained all the lawyerly reasons why this could be included. So let's.
So just tell us it's your list and move on.
No, I wanted to show that there was a master plan. I wanted everybody to see there was a master plan. And so it looks like I started out this section with a quote from said manual of discipline. So I guess I'll read the quote before we talk about what the manual of discipline is. And this is the order for the men of the community who have offered themselves to turn from all evil and to lay hold of all that he commanded according to his will, to be separated from the congregation of the men of error, to become a community in law and in wealth, answering when asked by the sons of Zadok, the priest, to keep the covenant. And that is how at the beginning of the manual of discipline. So what is the manual of discipline, and why have I included it in the top 10? Beginning in 1947, 1948, depending on which version of the story you follow, over 800 scrolls were discovered in the Judean desert caves near an ancient site called Qumran. Today, these are known popularly as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Officially, they are known as the Judean Scrolls.
They're all online now.
200 of the scrolls were ancient copies of Old Testament books. Those in themselves had a big impact, because one of the arguments against Christianity that started in the mid-20th century was, well, we have these translations of translations of translations, 2,000 years has gone by. Who knows if anything in the Bibles we have today actually matches what was in the original source documents? Well, then they found source documents from 2,150 years ago, and of course they translated them, and then they compared them to what we have today. Wow, they're pretty much the same. I mean, you know, there'd be an apostrophe out of place, a comma was here instead of here, but pretty much what had been handed down to us as the Old Testament indeed was the Old Testament. And if there were differences, it was a difference, why am I getting into this? It was the difference between the Septuagint version and the Masoretic text, and I don't know why I got into that because it has nothing to do with it. So moving on. What was more interesting to people like me was the other 600 scrolls. Because the other 600 scrolls, most of them had never been seen. So here they dig up this stuff in the desert in Israel. There's 600 scrolls. Most of them are in the 2,000 to 2,150 years old. And they've never been seen before. And they're religious texts. And we always say Christianity was based on Judaism. Okay, well that's great. Well then this raised the question, which Judaism? Because prior to the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the version of Judaism that we believe Christianity was based on is what today we call rabbinical Judaism. 2,000 years ago, at the time of Christ, we would have called the Judaism of the Pharisees. So how did that get passed down for 2,000 years? Why did the Pharisees win? Well, why wasn't the Sadducees? Or why wasn't the Essenes? Why 2,000 years after Christ did we just accept that the Pharisees defined Judaism? Well, it's pretty easy, because there was a Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 AD. First couple of years, the Jews won. Then Titus showed up with a massive army from Rome, and he wiped out the revolt. It ended up in a place called Masada, and that was the last stand of the Jewish revolt. Well, among the things that the Jewish revolt wiped out when the Romans got there was the Sadducees, the keepers of the temple. If your job is to keep the temple, and then the Romans destroy the temple, you gonna be unemployed? Yeah, you don't have a job anymore, so bye-bye Sadducees. The Romans also destroyed the centers of the Essenes, so the Essenes disappear from history. The only one left standing is the Pharisees. So 2,000 years go by, we get into the mid-20th century, and we all just accept that the Judaism that Christianity was based on is the Judaism of the Pharisees. But of course, there was always a flaw in that. Take the Essenes, for example. We didn't know much about the Essenes. So how do we know that Christianity wasn't based on the Essenes? Well, just because the Pharisees were the only ones left standing, so we assumed that was who it was. And you could get into a discussion with an Orthodox Jewish rabbi today, and he's going to say certain things about, well, the suffering servant described in Isaiah is not Jesus. It's referring to Jerusalem, and you know, they kind of have a set of things that kind of negate a lot of the Christian views of how you interpret the Old Testament, and they always end that up with, well, we're the Jews, we get to interpret the Old Testament, you don't, and it always ends up like that. Well, what would happen if another group 2,000 years ago had written their own interpretation of the scrolls, or their own interpretation of what we know as the Old Testament, and their interpretation turned out to be a whole lot like Presbyterianism? Well, gosh, that would kind of change all the rules, wouldn't it? And that's exactly what the Dead Sea Scrolls did. It showed that there were Jewish roots to a whole raft of Christian beliefs. Belief in angels, a belief in a suffering servant Messiah instead of the Messiah coming with the sword and the army behind him. Belief in hell, belief in Satan, belief in predestination. Apologies to you Baptists and Pentecostals and Methodists. What if that happened? Well, it happened in 1948 because they dug up these 600 scrolls, and they seemed to define the laws and the views of an unknown Jewish sect. But unfortunately, nowhere on any of these scrolls had anybody bothered to write, oh, by the way, this is from the Library of the Essenes. We all assume it's from the Library of the Essenes, but we don't know it's from the Library of Essenes because nobody said it was from the Library of the Essenes. It's like when I used to teach disciple Bible studies, I'd always reach into my pocket and I'd pull out $100 and I would lay it down. It's only 60, but it's for illustrative purposes only. And I would say, if any of you can show me in the 4 Gospels where it states who wrote any of those 4 Gospels, you can come up here and take the $100. Of course, desperately.
Got everybody to read them.
It must say somewhere in there that, and what they don't. Nowhere in the Gospels does it tell us who wrote those 4 Gospels. That comes from much later church tradition. What's the same with the Dead Sea Scrolls? There's 800 scrolls, 600 of them had never been seen before. And it doesn't say anywhere who wrote them. A guy named Father Roland DeVoe excavated Qumran in the 50s. And he's the one that first came up with that view that the site was an Essene monastery. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he had this habit of using Roman Catholic terms to describe this 2,000-year-old Jewish religious group. So he would talk about it being a monastery. He would talk about the people who lived there as being monks, that they ate in the refectory, and et cetera, et cetera. Tim, did you have your hand up? So he's the one that kind of came up with that idea that Qumran was an Essene site, and that the scrolls were the library